Hello everyone, and welcome to NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Jessica Coffey, and I'm the Associate Director here at the Institute. Our Future of Democracy Working Group and the Governance Lab at NYU are sponsoring tonight's book discussion of Politics with the People, Building a Directly Representative Democracy by Michael Niblow, Kevin Esterling, and David Lazer. We are excited tonight to have two of the book's authors here. David Lazer, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer and Information Science at Northeastern University and co-director of new labs for texts, maps, and networks. He is an author of two recent papers on misinformation in science, The Science of Fake News, and Fake News on Twitter during the 2016 US presidential election. He is lead author of the paper In Science, and Science, the periodical, the journal. It's very confusing. In Science, in 2014, that critiqued Google flu trends, which has emerged as an important touchstone in the use of big data to understand human behavior. He is the lead author on the 2009 science paper on computational social science, which has been described as the manifesto for the emerging field. We also have with us tonight Michael Niblow, Associate Professor of Political Science and Philosophy and Public Policy at Ohio State University, where he directs the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability and co-founded the Center for Ethics and Human Values. His first book, Deliberative Democracy, Between Theory and Practice, Cambridge University Press, 2015, cuts across the deadlock between supporters of deliberative democracy and their empirical critics by focusing on the goals of the larger deliberative political system. His recent grant from the Democracy Fund will support continuing research in cooperation with sitting members of Congress to develop best practices for constituent consultation. I will now pass the mic to Beth Simone Novak, Director of the Governance Lab and a Senior Fellow here at IPK, to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to IPK for hosting us, and thank you to you for coming. For those of you who don't know, you know already my name. I direct the Governance Lab, which is, like the IPK, another research institute here at NYU. We're an action research institute that works with public partners, including now increasingly with Congress. We can commiserate, to explore how to use new technologies to change how we govern. And together with IPK, we started this lecture series to focus on the future of democracy. This is an intentionally hopeful exercise. This is the fifth in a series of lectures. We obviously started off and had a long recitation of all the things we wanted to bemoan about rates of trust in government and declining rates of trust and the stagnation of our democracy and the decline of our democracy, but all of the things we have been talking about over the last year have been hopeful prescriptions for what to do about it. So we have spent actually very little to no time, except the 10 seconds I just spent now, telling you about all the troubles in the world. We get enough of that outside of here, and instead we come together here to explore how we can do things differently. We started with Audrey Tang, Digital Minister of Taiwan, telling us about digital democracy experiments in Taiwan. We heard from Jeff Mulgan from the UK, telling us about online collective intelligence and its use for improving and strengthening democracy. We had Cesar Hidalgo from MIT, together with political philosopher Jose Marti from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, talking about data democracy. And last time we had a standing room only crowd for Eric Kleinenberg's director of IPK, talking about his new book, Palaces for the People, which actually was not so much about new technology as it was about the very old technology about civic infrastructure and libraries and public spaces, and the role that they can play in helping to strengthen our democracy. Today, though, we turn to a new set of prescriptions and experiments that I think are quite both forward-thinking and far-reaching. And they are exciting for two reasons. One, because as you will hear, they both constitute important research that help to advance our understanding of citizen engagement and democratic participation and public deliberation. But I think almost more importantly, as action research, they describe and prescribe a way to actually do something that's real. And what you're going to hear today is not, with due deference to my two very distinguished academic colleagues, not very academic. And I mean that as a compliment, to say these describe real-world activities with members of Congress to bring about more direct, more deliberative, more participatory democratic practice, or as you'll hear from them, direct representative democracy. So I think we all can agree that nowadays the notion that our representative democratic institutions, the notion that they are supposed to represent us and serve us as citizens, is a very far cry from the truth. They probably do just about anything but express our individual will or give us an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the process. And this is not, what I'm saying is not partisan, it's not controversial. I actually just got off the Acela. I was in Washington a minute ago, meeting with the new head of the Congressional Modernization Committee. I should say a meeting which we had to do in the hallway, circling around the House Longworth office building because they don't even have a sofa that you can sit on in their office. The problems of rot and degeneration and under-resources is really quite phenomenal. But whereas their committee has focused to date on a broad range of proposals, from the sublime to the ridiculous, that I might add include more couches, an in contravening proposal which says do not spend taxpayer dollars on congressional couches, to the sublime, true, I read the transcripts, to the absolutely lofty but unattainable goal of changing the term of members of Congress and putting term limits on those members. Today we have a set of proposals that represent real practice, real action, and that are something we can hope to do, not 10 years from now, not 5 years from now, that you've already done and that we can hope to do more of right now. So we're really eager to hear from you about these new ideas for direct representative democracy and what that can mean for strengthening our democracy and restoring some of the trust in Congress. There's nowhere to go but up, gentlemen. So tell us, how do we get there?
Well, thank you very much. I honestly think that was my favorite introduction ever, because we're often met with incredulity. You did what? That's not real politics. And the response has typically been, what about actual sitting members of Congress talking to their actual constituents about actual pending legislation is not real politics. We realize it's not politics as it's normally done, but that's the point, right? So, thank you very much. I should probably cut some slides.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second just to say, if people are tweeting and you want to share the word of this, we're also live streaming at the GovLab, and we're taking, and if we have a small group, so I think people can ask questions, but if people are online, we want them to tweet questions to what, to the two, hashtag IPK? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no.
So hashtag IPK for questions for people who are not in the room, and at the GovLab on Twitter for the live stream.
Terrific. No.
I forgot my, yes, exactly, the town, we have our own town hall here.
Terrific. So we'll be presenting today, as Beth said, on Politics with the People, Building a Directly Representative Democracy, which is a book that David and I, along with our missing co-author, Kevin Esterling, published last September. Does anybody happen to know what this is a picture of? I mean, beyond the Capitol dome under construction? It's Lincoln's first inaugural. It's actually a fairly significant, historically significant photo. Lincoln's first inaugural was also the first inauguration at which people of color were allowed to attend. And in other pictures from this collection, you can see many different kinds of people mixing and coming to the People's House. And we like this picture in particular for a couple of reasons, but one of them being to echo Lincoln's notion of politics of, by, and for the people, which even in his time, of course, had to be understood metaphorically. But we think more literally that we can aspire to a politics with the people. And the construction of the Congress is, we think, a nice metaphor for thinking of our democracy as something that we need to build and maintain, not merely put up once and let run on autopilot. So if you'll let me start with a little bit of family background. On the left here is my grandfather, Stefano Napolillo, and on the right is my daughter, Anna Niblow. Stefano here, well, my grandfathers together had 6 years of schooling. And that includes my other non-pictured grandfather here going through the 6th grade, which means Stefano here had exactly 0 days of schooling in his entire lifetime, was illiterate till the day he died in both his native Italian and his adopted English, and signed his name with an X, which is why my name, Niblow, only vaguely sounds like Napolillo, because off the shores here a little bit when he came through Ellis Island, that's what the immigration officer wrote down. So why am I showing you these two pictures? Well, it's often thought that the founding principle behind democracy is equality, the equal dignity of everybody in helping direct the course of their lives through politics. But if we really think about it, it's a very radical kind of equality. My daughter Anna is in the 7th grade right now. She already has more schooling than her 4 great-grandfathers put together. And yet democracy is the belief, I would even go so far as to call it the faith, that someone like her, who when she turns 18 will have had much more schooling than her great-grandfathers. Turns out her great-grandmothers were much more educated and sort of ran the show for the families, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. The belief of the faith that it's somehow sensible that this young woman who's going to have lots of education go on to do great things and go to college and anything after, she will sort of in many respects leave my grandfather in the dust. And yet when she turns 18, she'll get the same 1 vote that my grandfather got when he came to this country, poor, illiterate, and unaccustomed to the rights and responsibilities of democratic citizenship. But critics of democracy have said that's exactly what's crazy about it, that there's a difference between these two people. And so we're in search for a second principle to go with equality. And this is a picture of the tomb of Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden was the governor of this state. He has the distinction of being the only presidential candidate who won an outright majority of the popular vote and failed to ascend to the presidency. And I don't know if you can, he was a wealthy fellow and had this elaborate tomb put together. I don't know if you can see on it, but it's engraved, "I still trust the people," which when I saw it I thought was very, very funny, in a bit of a swipe at the Electoral College that denied him the presidency. But in political theory, in political science, Tilden is actually known better for something else he said about this question of what you have to pair with equality. He says, "Majority rule, just as majority rule, is as foolish as its critics suppose. But it's never merely majority rule. The means by which the majority comes to be the majority is the more important thing." And so I want to suggest to you that in addition to equality, that what democracies need is quality. Quality reasoning, quality processes, quality campaigns, quality in all manner of the deliberative processes of our politics. And for today's purposes, I'm going to gloss quality as deliberation, since I'm a scholar of what's come to be called deliberative democracy. For those of you who might not have a sense of what deliberative democracy refers to, it's actually really quite simple. Beth, what brand of toothpaste do you use?
It's a weird German brand.
It's not working. Okay, well, Colgate sucks. You should use Crest, right? If I had really said, if I really meant that Colgate sucks and she should use Crest, Beth might reasonably say to me, "Shut up. I like Colgate. Leave me alone," right? The key idea behind deliberative democracy is that that's fine for toothpaste. But if I'm going to tell you who you can love and count as a member of your family, or I'm going to take your property in the form of taxes and redistribute it for other social purposes, or I'm going to send you or your sons or daughters off to war, then it's not okay if you question me about my positions on issues like this. If I say, "Shut up, leave me alone, that's what I want." That I owe you an explanation that goes beyond mere power, counting heads, money, political office. The key idea behind deliberative democracy is we owe each other an account, that democracy needs quality in addition to equality. Well, on those criteria, we might not feel that things are going so well in American democracy right now. The Senate is supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, and that seems more like a painful joke than a reality right now, and that the major parties, when they're not comically behaving, have descended into something that's deadly serious and is approaching a blood sport. And for their part, it's not clear that average citizens are doing a particularly good job in putting themselves in a position to discharge their duties as democratic citizens. One of the best known and replicated findings in all of political science, is the shocking levels of political ignorance among the average American voter. And in addition to worries over equality, there's deep worries over equality. We might be formally equal in certain respects, but the role of power, and especially money, in politics, I think, calls into question whether either of our core principles are really doing particularly well right now. Okay, now I will stop being negative because Beth also set that up rather beautifully. That's why I was going to cut some slides. And say that this has led to consolidating, this has led to deep concerns about the health of American democracy and that we might be on a sinking ship of state. Well, under those circumstances, it's reasonable to think about reform approaches. And we think that there are three main reform approaches going right now. One I'll call hands-on or plebiscitary democracy, sometimes called direct democracy, but I need that word for something else. So the idea is initiatives, referenda, recalls, things along those lines. The other is the exact opposite, what I'll call the hands-off or technocratic approach. The idea here is to insulate the policy process from politics and just let the experts get on with formulating the solutions that we all know in the end will serve us best, supposedly. And then the third I'll call the double down, or what in political science is often called the pluralist approach. And the claim there is that what's wrong with our parties and interest groups is not that they're too strong, but rather that we weakened them through well-intentioned but ill-considered reforms that have led to non-responsible party government, and that we should actually reform back to the 1950s with stronger parties and taking the reins off of interest groups. Well, our view is that all three of these, for some purposes, might have some value, but none of them cut to the heart of what ails the democratic body politic. And so what we propose is an alternative that we call directly representative democracy. And each of those three words is going to contrast with one of the reform approaches that I just talked about. Directly representative democracy is direct versus the double down approach, in that its core normative claim is that you, every one of you, has standing as a citizen or even just a resident of a district or a state before your elected representatives, merely in virtue of being a person who lives there. That you don't have to go through parties and interest groups to have your voice heard. And right now, the worry is there aren't institutions to make your voice heard or efficacious, taken for granted. That's what politics is. DRD is representative versus the hands-on approach in that we can't all quit our day jobs, and we're not calling for elimination of Article 1 of the Constitution and direct legislation from average people. We're going to primarily work with the institutions of representative government, at least at the federal level, as we find them, which is not to say that some of them couldn't be improved upon, but that's not what we're doing right now in the theory of directly representative democracy. And it's democratic versus the hands-off approach in that there's going to be a robust role, an important role, for average citizens to play in the political process that goes beyond showing up every 2, 4, or 6 years and checking a box on a ballot if you bother to show up and check that box. So what do we have in mind? What sort of institutions might move us in this direction? Well, the one that we're going to be talking about today is town halls, online deliberative town halls. But this is a picture from Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms series, which is a riff off of President Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. This is freedom of speech. And what could be problematic here? You've got this nice-looking fellow here standing, average-looking guy. He's come prepared. He's got information in his pocket. All of the people around him are in rapt attention, paying attention to this. This has to be a civic good, right? Well, I'll address the realism of this in a moment, but even as it's depicted here, because it's not clear that Rockwell was known for his gritty depictions of the civic underbelly of American life, but even if we just look as it's depicted, this is a white guy. Everybody else in the frame is a white guy. And we don't have this broader conversation in the democratic public. So you might be thinking to yourself, town halls, you've got to be kidding me. Now the panel on the right is at an actual town hall that President Obama held. The fellow here, I don't know if you can see, is holding a gun in his holster here, and holding a sign that says, "It's time to water the tree of liberty," which is a quote from Thomas Jefferson that ends with, "The blood of patriots and tyrants." Presumably he's a patriot and President Obama is a tyrant. He's basically threatening to assassinate the president, which is not exactly how we think deliberative democracy should be going here. And average town halls, the ones you've seen on YouTube and maybe even have attended, might not be this bad, but they're not often sort of examples of quality deliberation. And here, I don't know if you can see this, but it looks like the fellow on the right might even be like the radicalized grandson of the genial citizen on the left here, that American democracy has descended over these 2 generations. Okay, so why are town halls not working well? One is, and we'll present evidence on this, we can't stress it enough, the people who go to them are wildly unrepresentative of the state and districts that they're in, which is not to say that the people who go there are bad citizens or shouldn't be praised, or have a right, the people have a right to petition government for the redress of grievances, and they can present that in a way that's a grievance, that is emotionally powerful. We simply want to claim there should also be room for deliberation, and a more representative set of voices. Because they're so wildly unrepresentative, there's almost no persuasion. We've known this for about 50 years in political science research. The only people who show up are the ones who already love their member of Congress and are just looking for marching orders. They don't need to be persuaded. Or they're the most implacable foes who cannot be persuaded. And so members don't try to. And then finally, members of Congress have stopped doing town halls at the rate that they used to. And the ones that they do, we did interviews with about 100 offices. And in private conversations, staffers will admit that these are highly managed events. They try to pack the room with supporters. They filter out questions that might embarrass their member. In general, these are not authentic sort of engagement between elected officials and their constituents, but rather highly managed stage affairs. So in our research, we basically asked ourselves, can we do better? Well, if we're going to say better, we have to explain what better means. And so our criteria, going back to the beginning here, for quality is first inclusive participation. The people participating should look and sound like the American public, or at least the district and the state in which this is, the events are going on. Second, there should be informed engagement. People can't just make up their own facts. There has to be a basis of knowledge and common knowledge in order to move forward on reasoning together deliberatively. And third, we were looking for reasoned persuasion, that people should change their minds or be open to changing their minds, but not merely to be manipulated. Now, the reasoned part is going to be very complicated here, and we'll gloss over that in the presentation. We will show evidence of persuasion. But in the Q&A, if you'd like, we can talk more about that, because we went to great lengths to try to demonstrate what we think was the quality of these persuasive processes. But in addition to the quality of the process, it's got to have an impact. We want to scale this up, as Beth was saying. This isn't just a little experiment on the side. We want this to help change American politics. In order for that to be the case, it's got to be worthwhile for constituents, or they're not going to show up in large enough numbers to affect the larger political system. Similarly, it's got to be worthwhile for officials, or they're not going to show up and participate in numbers large enough to affect the larger political system. And finally, it's got to work at scale. Some of the sessions we did were about 35 people, which is pretty much retail politics. It's got to be able to go to a level that's large enough for members of Congress to feel like they're spending their time well and to affect the larger deliberative system. So I will now turn it over to David to talk about the design features of the experiment.
So, in order to evaluate these ideas, we put democracy into the test tube. Actually, we had 3 test tubes. Right? One was the town hall test tube, but then the second one, people didn't get town halls, and then in the third one, they just got some background information, but no more. And we had invited in a total of 2,000 citizens, these are constituents from congressional districts, to participate in these town halls. These town halls were online. I'll give you a little video in a moment. And I said there were these 3 conditions, these 3 test tubes, as it were. Now, if we're studying something, again, we have to operationalize the general principles that Michael just outlined into particular execution. There's this design question, which in part, might be design of the technology, but it's really about how you use the technology. And so there were 6 key principles that were derived from what Michael was talking about earlier. The first principle was that the participants, the constituents, be informed about the substance of the topic under discussion. Second is that be focused on a particular topic. That goes along with informing them. You can't inform citizens about everything. They're authentic. That is, in this case, it was voice mediated, so they could tell that it was actually the member of Congress rather than some staff person. It was also authentic because it involved a neutral moderator. Actually, Michael was a very, it could be very neutral. Not boring, but well balanced. And so these weren't cherry-picked questions, right? There were tough questions, there were blunt questions, these events were fair. So when people posted questions, they got distributed around, and we had an effort to try to not keep on going back to the same person. I don't know if you've ever been in meetings where one person does all the talking. That could not happen in the way we moderated this. And they were diverse. So we actually had representative people, representative citizens. So we worked with a survey company that picked out a sample that was representative of the district. And just so you get a real sense of what the town hall looked like, I'm going to show you this has a little clip, so it's around a minute or so. It begins with a brief introduction of the member, who is allowed to then say something about the issue. The issue in this case that was under discussion was the issue of immigration. And the member of Congress was a moderate Republican from California, George Radanovich, not in office anymore, actually. This took place in the summer of 2006.
Well, good morning and thank you. My name is George Radanovich. I said the 19th.
There's a real-time captionist, so if people had audio problems, they can still participate.
Well, during right now, the House voted on a version in December that I voted no against. It was strictly on the border enforcement and didn't feel, I think, was one of the more important issues that Carrie, she had why we spend so much time with immigrants. We have poverty that's bringing right to the world. Well, because the United States is a comprehensive gentle nation, we are not going to allow anybody who is a citizen not to suffer on the street. It's just not what we are as Americans.
And so there are a few neat things about that, and I think a lovely sentiment at the end, but also one that was in some sense confronting lightly the constituent, disagreeing with the constituent. The question before was asking the member how they stood on the position on the issue and how they had voted. So the issues of accountability, but also frank discussion between representatives and their citizens was something that was a particularly nice set of clips, but actually it was roughly typical of what happened in all these sessions. We had a dozen U.S. representatives participate, and the average size of the town halls was 25 or so. There's a distribution in size. And then we wanted to scale it up in size, and I'll mention that at the end, with a Senator 11. This was a replication of the original experiment. The other dozen talked about the issue of immigration. Senator 11 talked about detainee policy and around torture and the like. And so what did we find when we made these comparisons between the people who participated in the town halls and relative to the two control groups? Well, there are a number of things. And the first thing I'll note was who actually showed up, right? Like Woody Allen said, 90% of life is showing up, right? Well, there's a notion about politics that most Americans would prefer if the system just worked, cleaned up things, as it were, and they could just sit on the couch, right, and not participate, right? If the only reason to participate is to keep the scoundrels accountable, right? And there's a whole vein of literature in political science that makes that suggestion. Our data were not consistent with that in multiple ways. First of all, there was a very high yes rate. So when we asked people if they would like to participate in the town halls, 70% said yes in principle. Now, of those 70%, then 30% actually did, because once you say 7 p.m. Wednesday, a lot of people are, I'm busy then, we're going out, we're having dinner. Yes?
Did you compensate participants?
So this was part of a survey panel. So participants this was a company called Knowledge Network, so it's just been gobbled up multiple times now. It's part of Ipsos. And so when you're part of a survey panel, you get, in this case at least, you get a certain degree of compensation. Part of that was to maintain a representative sample. And so if you give people compensation, then it helps maintain the representativeness of the sample. Indeed, one of the things they did was give people internet connection if they didn't have internet connection. So very high yes rates, very high cooperation rates. But what was really striking, there are a few things. In terms of the people who showed up, demographically, they were actually more representative of eligible voters than actual voters are. So think about that, because actual voters are not representative of eligible voters. They're biased in terms of race, gender, income, education, and all the standard predictors, with one exception, cut the opposite direction, right? The one exception was education. And that was not just about with respect to attending, right? It was also about speaking up, because there's a pretty powerful critique of deliberative democracy that the people who actually end up speaking up in groups aren't representative of the group, and in particular looking at gender, that men speak up too much relative to their share of the floor. And in part because of the design of the system, there was no relationship between gender and questions being asked. There was no relationship between class, education, and the like. And the other thing that was pretty neat was that another finding is that those who are most cynical about politics, right, who had the most systemic skepticism, they were the most likely to show up, right? Because they're like, I don't participate because I don't believe in the system. But when invited in, they're like, oh, the system's a little different than I thought. So that, again, was a very satisfying finding. So other results, big increase in knowledge. As consistent with prior research, the baseline of knowledge in the control group, really low. I mean, actually, essentially zero, right? People did as well as flipping a coin on these multiple choice questions. There were 20% jumps in knowledge around the issues, and this was in part because of the accountability of actually showing up to these events. It wasn't just that these were things that were mentioned by the member, and it wasn't, and all types of people, again, this wasn't just like a subpopulation, like those who already knew about politics, the winners, people who are those that have get. We actually found a pretty systematic improvement in knowledge across the board. There was persuasion, and we'd argue reasoned persuasion, so this is one of the things that makes it worthwhile to members to do, but there was movement towards the member on the issues. So on immigration across a variety of dimensions, there was like a 14% shift towards the member, and on the issue with Senator Levin, there was a 9% shift on the issue of torture. It was worthwhile for constituents. The comments, we had open-end comments, and we coded them, classified positive, negative. They were almost all positive, around 85% or so positive. And most of the negative ones were things like, I had audio problems, I had tech problems. It's like, we all have tech problems, that's just the fact of life, unfortunately. But 95% said, this is valuable for democracy. 97%, like, 97% would like to do another one, right? Like, how many people want to do the same thing again? Like, the degree of enthusiasm about these events was palpable, right? Quantitatively, qualitatively, just incredible enthusiasm. It was worthwhile for the members. There were increases in trust. Trust of the members is really important to them politically. Increase in approval ratings. And really, quite remarkably, just from a scientific point of view, and substantively, was that we looked whether they were more likely to vote for the member 4 months after the event took place. And there was a 10% jump. And to give a little context, most social psych experiments done in the basement, you're lucky if they last 4 hours in terms of the effects. So the notion that this could actually move and change political behavior 4 months later is pretty remarkable. Not only that, not only they're more likely to vote for the member, they're just more likely to vote, period. this scales up. So and there are multiple ways. We did this with Senator Levin. So the smaller events were around 25 people. With Senator Levin, there was 175 people. Once you get to 175, actually the experience doesn't change much more if you go from 175 to 2,000, because the odds that your question will be asked are pretty low when you get to 175. But the fact that it's happening synchronously, and the fact is that probably someone else asked a question sort of like your question, somehow made it powerful, and the treatment effects were almost identical. I mean, a different subject area, which was surprising, because a different subject area, different sample, and I won't get into the weeds right now, but like the sample, it was a different kind of more politically interested sample of people, and yet we had very similar effects generally. And the other thing we did, and this was set with the bigger session, was that we did a social network examination of how the message and how the experience rippled outwards from the online town hall. So we asked people before, who are the people you talk to about politics? And then after we asked them, did you talk about Senator Levin? Did you talk about detainee policy? And we compared that to the control groups, where the baseline was essentially zero. You know, it's not people; these are not things people generally are going to talk about a week later, in the next week. But we estimated for the treatment group that for each were affected outside of the online town hall. And this is a conservative estimate because we're only asking about 3 of their friends. We're not asking about everyone, right? And then we're also not asking about further ripples. We're not asking their friends, you know, who did you talk more about Senator Levin? So we estimate that, for example, if each member of Congress did this for, let's say, 2 sessions a week, 2 hours. Now note, this is really just 2 hours. So they're not driving anywhere for a town hall or wherever. They can do this in the luxury of their family room if they want, right? They can do this anywhere. They can do it in a car while they're driving. If they did this a couple hours a week for 6 years, they would actually reach roughly a quarter of their electorate. So it's one of those things, if you imagine just a consistent maintenance, it's going to build up. It's going to affect lots of people, and also it's just going to affect, we hope, and this is more conjecture, but educated conjecture, the more general tenor of discussion. And the other things that the other thing I'd mention is just this also sets up sort of a discussion amongst people, right? So it's not just a conversation between members and citizens, but it's setting up a conversation amongst citizens, and amongst it creates connections across diverse people who have different priorities, but are all participating in that same online town hall. And we just don't get enough of that in our democracy. So, for all of this, and this all did take place in 06 and 08, the question you might ask is, what's next? So Mike, what's next?
Okay, I'll try to go quickly here so we have time for questions and discussion. But we have already done some work since 2008 on various aspects of these sorts of institutional reforms. I'm not going to go into those. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the next major push. It turns out Senator Kilmer, that Beth was mentioning, is one of the offices we're going to be meeting with, Representative Kilmer, Congressman Kilmer, is one of the offices we'll be meeting with, and we're trying to recruit a new sample. And the primary scientific question that we're asking in this context is there mutual influence? David documented a lot of influence going from the elected officials to the constituents, but we might actually worry a little bit about this if the influence were only one directional. And we really we just didn't gather a lot of systematic evidence in the first go about influence flowing the other way. But through my institute at Ohio State, I bought out some time of other faculty and some graduate students, and we're embedding in some offices and going to be presenting the results that, like what David showed, to the offices with meetings between the communications and legislative wings of the offices, and are going to try to understand how they will make use of such information, whether and how they make use. Now, if you're skeptical that they are interested in it, the one thing that I'll mention is, in the way that we pitch this to the members, is the idea of what's in political science called latent public opinion. And the idea behind latent public opinion is what public opinion is going to look like after elected officials have acted. Not ex ante, but ex post. After you've had a chance to walk around in the policy for a little while in those shoes, right? And you mention that to members of Congress, and their eyes go wide. They lean forward. They're very interested in knowing what's going to happen at election time, not necessarily whether they're popular or unpopular at the moment that they cast the vote. Okay, I'm going to pivot really quickly and explain why we think there's reason to be hopeful that members will be responsive to this information, although it starts with some bad stuff first. So to begin with, here's just a picture of different occupations, and here's a stack bar chart of voters by occupation. And there's executives, professionals, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, etc. Here is a corresponding bar chart of the organizations that lobby for those groups. And you'll see that about 20% of the US population has about 91% of the lobbying capacity. So members of Congress are hearing from the powerful and well-off in society. Not exactly a shocker, but perhaps, sort of discouragingly, it's hard to hear whispers. The 80%, the responsiveness to average voters, people at the 50th percentile, though the percent favoring change and the probability that the change happening is almost flat. The opinions of the people in the middle are more or less ignored. It's hard to hear whispers. It's not hard to hear megaphones. Responsiveness to voters in the top 10% follows something close to a 45-degree line, meaning that they do what they're told. That the top 10% in the public really gets what they want out of policy. Again, not a huge surprise, but worth documenting. We think that it's largely related to this communication story, that that's really who they hear from. And we'll explain why we think that that's important and relevant here. In addition, constituents preach to the choir. Even if you're not one of the powerful and the wealthy, it turns out you're dramatically more likely to contact or try to influence your member of Congress if he or she shares your party. That you basically leave the other ones as a lost cause. Not everybody, of course, but the off-partisans tend to be the most ideologically extreme and aren't often very influential on those members, and the members tend to be fairly dismissive of them. So they're really hearing from a very distorted, highly selected view, sample of their constituents. And here's the upshot of this. I don't know if people can see it in the back, but these are 5 graphs on carbon regulation, repealing the Affordable Care Act, gun sales, infrastructure, and a $12 minimum wage. On the x-axis here is staffer. These are congressional staffer estimates of how much support there is for these 5 policies in their district or states. And on the y-axis is a good estimate of the actual support. Now, if they had good information and really understood what was going on in their states, the dots should cluster along the dashed diagonal line here. As you can see, they're almost flat. There's almost no effect of the actual distribution of support in states and districts on the estimated or perceived level of support. And moreover, as you can tell, these go red to blue or blue to red, meaning that you're hearing from the people that agree with you to begin with, and reinforce the notion that huge swaths of the district already agree with your position. Democrats think that the Democratic side has all the support, and Republicans vice versa. And they end up in a position, we think, of the well-intentioned but really clueless husband who gives his wife a toaster for their anniversary, and aren't very responsive in policy. Okay. But we asked the question, what if they really did know and have an accurate sense? And it turns out, you might think, oh, there's polls all the time. There are national polls. And we talk to the members, and they say, I don't care what the national polls say. I want to know what my constituents think. And they can't, especially in the House, they cannot afford to do polls on a bunch of issues, or any issues really, at the level of congressional districts. So some political scientists, not us, did this really wonderful, interesting experiment. This was at the state level, where the randomization was a random field experiment, and the randomization was whether they simply informed the office they did pay for a high-quality poll at the district that could disaggregate to the district level. And they just randomized whether the office got the information about where their district stood. Unsurprisingly, if the office did not get the information, it's flat. They're not responsive to it. Here is if they got the information. They were highly responsive to it. Now, this is one issue. It's at the state level. We don't want to overgeneralize, but we think we have reason to think and to believe that there's reason for civic hope. And more to the point, the directly representative Democratic reforms that aim to arm the elected officials with high-quality information about the informed opinions of their constituents will actually lead to democratic responsiveness, and we think ultimately healthier body politic. So let me end by saying thanks to Beth for inviting us, to all of you for your time and attention, in advance for your questions.
So why don't we have you both up here, and I will, if it's okay, exercise moderator's prerogative and ask a first question or two, and I'm just gonna give that to you to see. We'll have people join, and I have so many questions, I'm trying to decide where to start. I've made such a long list, but nobody else will get to ask anything if I do all of these. So let me start first with the more academic question and then the more practical question. So the sort of more academic question is, obviously, to some extent, this work is in conversation with and in reaction to Jim Fishkin's work around deliberative polling. And I'm wondering, thank you, that's not on, that's okay, I'm very loud. So this is in reaction to and in conversation with Fishkin's work around deliberative polling. Oh, sorry, the flower. And I'm wondering both in terms of the nature of the experiment design, the nature of the prescriptions, you write about this, but I wonder if you can say a little bit more, just situate yourself against kind of that tradition that you're coming out of, what you see as having been the shortcomings there, and what you see as being the benefits here. And I'm going to give it a twofer while I'm doing the academic question. Because on the one hand, there's sort of this school of thought around deliberative democracy that's been represented by these experiments around deliberative polling. On the other hand, there's also a new body of work that's often characterized as what we might call epistemic democracy. And there are people like Helen Landemore at Yale, who has a new book about to be out, or soon out, or just out, and others who've written in this vein that essentially tries to make the case that we want to actually try to maximize for what, this is a mischaracterization to some extent, but I would put in my own words, we want to take more advantage of what people know. This is very much still about representative sampling, as opposed to being about either self-selection or the epistemic value of people to participate differently because they may be a truck driver or a doctor. And I'm wondering if you can just situate yourself a little bit in conversation with that, with these two literatures, and then I'll ask you something more practical.
That is all you.
Okay, well, it's not all me, David.
That's why you realize.
Yeah. So interestingly, in the next issue of Perspectives on Politics, there's going to be a critical exchange between Jim Fishkin and us. We reviewed each other's books and then got to reply to each other's reviews. So one answer is, wait a couple months and you'll be able to read that. But I can give you perhaps a few more satisfying points. The first thing to note is that we think quite a bit of what Jim has done is very valuable. I'm not going to get up here and just trash what Jim has done. That said, we do think we have real and substantial and multidimensional value added over what he's done. The biggest one being that for the most part he doesn't involve elected officials, or if he's involving elected officials, it's as spectators. And that this is vertical deliberation, it's direct deliberation between elected officials and their constituents, and part of our thought is to reform how representative institutions that we have on the ground work right now. Whereas I think he's trying to scaffold onto representative institutions from the outside, which again I add, we think is a valuable exercise in certain respects. But that, I would say, is the first big difference. The second big difference is that typically he looks at a large polity, let's say the entire United States or the state of Texas, if it's some sort of Texas-related issue. As I mentioned, one of the things we hear constantly from elected officials is, I don't care what the national polls say, I want to hear about my constituents. Similarly, I don't care what the polls on all of Texas says. If you're a state senator in Texas, she wants to hear what her Senate, the constituents in her Senate district believe. So I think that's a second big difference between Jim Jim's position and ours. The third might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but in my first book I developed my own version of a systemic conception of deliberative democracy, where what we're doing here is just one bit player in a larger system of trying to reform the quality of talk-based politics in the courts, in lobbying, in campaigns all over the place. And that this is, we think, one very valuable piece of low-hanging fruit, but it's part and conditioned upon a larger context. Jim, for the most part, is really, he's got this tool, and it's a powerful, flexible tool, but that's his thing. Whereas we're trying to see how this can ramify and ripple through the larger system. That's all I'll say for Fishkin, about Fishkin right now. As far as epistemic Democrats go, and Ellen and other folks along those lines, I think she's brilliant and does great work. And am persuaded, and have actually moved to be a bit more epistemic than proceduralist by the force of her argument, actually. So how does that relate to what she talks about? I've talked to her about it. I think she likes what we do and thinks that it is deploying, it's getting people to shift out of their intuitive gut reactions and start thinking, to share, to elevate voices that are typically excluded or marginalized, doing all the sorts of things that an epistemic Democrat would want to be done. So I think there's reasons to think we can make better decisions that an epistemic Democrat would value. Epistemic Democrats, the idea is there's a right decision, and the reason democracy is good is not because we're all equal, it's because it helps us make better decisions. And if it doesn't help us make better decisions, maybe we don't need democracy. Now, they think that it will help us properly set up, and I think that's why she appreciates some of our work, is that we're helping warrant the notion that democratic practices will make good decisions.
So two quick, sort of two-parter back to you, and I want to come back to a piece of this here, to David, really. So one is, I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the kind of conversation that it was possible to have and not have in the town hall context. I'm not talking about immigration versus torture. I'm really talking about, and this gets a little bit to the question of, you obviously talked a lot about being fair and balanced and neutral and how you selected the questions, but there's a contour or context to the type of conversation. And this gets a little bit back to what I was asking before. So the epistemic notion is both about the idea that there is an outcome, which is somewhat missing from some of the procedural approaches. But some of the epistemic, this is a little bit what I'm talking about when I talk about who's participating, what they know, what they come to a dialogue with. This is not necessarily designed to take advantage of that specifically. So I'm curious whether you have any reflection on the town hall as a model in terms of setting expectations going forward for scaling this. These are the kind of conversations you can and can't have. This is what you can expect to get from people as opposed to say to them. Anything you can say about the quality of the conversation. And the second part of that, related part of that question is, David is obviously both political scientist and computer scientist. Now in a next generation of technologies, with the advent of, we were talking a little bit before about artificial intelligence, what is the next set of experiments you would like to do? Congress is so far behind that doing the town hall is already a big leap. But if, 50 years from now, what would you hope that the next set of experiments would look like? Well, let's hope it's 5 years from now. The next set of experiments, what are the new tools? What is the thing that would excite you in terms of the bringing in some more cutting edge technologies?
Sure. Starting to get something to happen there. So, okay. So let me give some quick reactions to that. First of all, and we didn't go into this, but we did evaluate. There are some metrics that have been developed to evaluate deliberative quality. It's called the QI, Deliberative Quality Index. But in part, it's about, like, are you giving a rationale for why you believe something? Are you providing facts? Is it just appeals to emotion? And these were the first thing I'd say is, was very high. higher actually than you see for congressional debate, which may not be a very high standard, but that there was something about, and part of the, and if you listen to these, actually, you feel pretty good about democracy. I mean that's a gut thing, but we listened to all of these, we participated in all of these, at least on the flies in the wall. Mike was the neutral moderator, but the rest of us were listening. And these were remarkably high quality events. And it's true that this was not a sort of collective intelligence task where everyone in the group had their bits of specialized knowledge about immigration, say, because in fact they did not know much about immigration, but they also did have certain perspectives or views that they offered, so they had obviously had privileged access to their own predispositions about what should be done, and presented that to the member. Like we saw, why are we spending so much in illegal aliens when we have so much poverty at home? Right? That was a perspective on the issue. The member reacted, and that was a totally legitimate exchange that one would want to have. But in any case, the deliberative quality was high. It was also high, like, we had a very light-handed moderation, which was, we went with the top question being asked as we queued them up, and like it was done in temporal submission, except for a few exceptions. Number one, if they were redundant with prior questions, we skipped it. Number two, if the same person, we would try to go to new people before we repeated questions. Number three, we had a rule where we were filtering out any offensive content of various kinds that you might imagine. Sometimes, that happens online. So, you say, really? So, there were 1,400 questions submitted, or comments. How many of them do you think were screened out because of noxious content? What percent? Okay, how many people would say a quarter or more? Okay, how about 5% or more? 1% or more? Okay, so the number we had was 0. We didn't filter out a single question. So there was something about the setting, and I think there was a normative environment that was created when you say, when you have your neutral moderator, a member of Congress who starts out with a sober remark, and you frame it in a certain way, that created a normative environment that elicited good behavior. But also, I think it reflects on the random sample of people. I think when you have a regular town hall, you do not get a random sample of people. You get people, as Mike was saying, on the extremes, and that who are there either to yell or to support. And I think actually, ironically, the average citizen is more reasonable than that. So I think part of it was a normative environment, and part of it had to do with creating a more representative sample of people who were interacting. That said, we didn't fully test the counterfactual. We have been somewhat ethically problematic to structure these in a way where we thought that it would be a failed deliberation. Let's see if we can make this blow up in the member's face. Was not really an experimental option. So so there's an interesting question, and in some ways there's some of these things we're relaxing in some of the experiments that we are currently doing, because we are actually taking it to what's next, which I'll ask Mike maybe if you can take a minute or two on that. But so there are elements of that we're relaxing, because that was actually a pretty expensive model to get a really good statistical representative sample, and also we had a particular format. And so we'll get a little bit more light on some of these issues going forward, because we're having a little less control, and there's that danger sometimes when you control things a little less that they may get out of hand. So we'll see. So I don't know, Mike, if you want to just talk about what we're doing experimentally now. I haven't fully wrapped my mind around the 50 years from now question, or even 5 years. But we are doing stuff right now which is different from what we did before. I will say also on the other things in technology, there's the interesting question of how we imagine a full range of technologies enabling and empowering conversations among citizens and between citizens and their representatives. I have to say, relative to some of the imagined futures from 20 years ago, our status quo isn't entirely satisfactory. I think we have a vision here about how to be better, but and there is, I think part of the question is whether we can design some of the things that we did in these little town halls as broader features to elicit a broader range of participation, but also have robust deliberation where the rotten apple doesn't spoil the bunch. And so there's an interesting question of how we deploy these technologies in a way that the ends of the distribution don't spoil it for everyone else.
We'll invite others who want to chime in.
Can I ask one question before I start passing the mic? It's in terms of accessibility, so both along language lines, so translation, vision impaired, hearing impaired, but also for lower income citizens who may not have the internet hookup, which you talked about as one of the perks of participating, but will there be ways for public spaces to have accessibility? So libraries, schools, community centers, and otherwise, will there be the ability to log in?
Sure, great question. So we're pushing as far as we can on that within cost constraints. So we were able to push back up on that a lot in the original round just because we overcame digital divide. They had stratified samples, so they made sure that they had people from underrepresented groups and the less affluent. Going forward, the digital divide is a little bit less of an issue now, not to say not an issue, but a little less of an issue. One member has talked about doing a Spanish language event. Trying to get all languages in is tricky. We've used real-time captionists in the past, court reporters basically, if you're hearing impaired, to try to create accessibility for the hearing impaired. And there's voice for the sight impaired. So I guess the short answer is we are attentive to that. And the other thing that we'd sort of point out is relative to standard town halls. This is a huge jump in accessibility because precisely the people who have trouble accessing, a less affluent single mother can't afford to hire a babysitter for 4 hours to travel back and forth, spend the whole, for ours, they just have to put in a video for their kids. So that's something that we feel strongly about and try to attend as much as we can, though to be perfectly honest, we're not perfect on this. We've just pushed as far as we can.
Good evening. I have two quick questions, one global, quote unquote, and the other local. I'll start with the local question. What influence do you believe your work will bear out on scenarios like what happened in the Florida and Georgia gubernatorial elections in terms of polling? And the global question will be Brexit. A couple of years ago, the natives there voted in favor of it, and now they're trying to execute it, and they're encountering all kinds of obstacles. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on those two subjects. Thank you.
So the real quick one on Brexit, I literally would bet my house that if they had done deliberative events ahead of Brexit, they would have voted down Brexit. I realize it's cheap talk. I can't bet my house on that. But everything I've
How about your citizenship?
Except for the symbolic sort of insult to saying that I would threaten my franchise, yes. That's how strongly I believe that. I just think it's almost certainly true. As far as you said Florida and
Yeah, I just use those two as an example, the gubernatorial elections in Florida, and especially Georgia, because that's gotten more coverage, but also
Yeah.
Florida, because that would be the one I have somewhat of a connection to, so I just threw that in there.
So what, why don't you take that one?
Well, there are a few elements to this, and one element is I don't think, I think this is what we've put down here is resolves or addresses some issues with our democracy. And there are a lot of other problems that it doesn't especially address. Maybe Mike, you would disagree with that, but I think the issue, because you're talking about like some of the issues around access to voting and so on. I think, I mean, I can give you a long list around, inequality, education, et cetera, which have manifest implications for our democracy, which this does not particularly directly connect with. I will say my hope is that if we enable more conversations across lines, because as I said, one of the things that these town halls did was connect citizens to each other, at least within their district, to a more diverse set of people than they see on their daily life. And I think that it's one of the things that you hope results is a degree of empathy and understanding for people who have different positions than you. I can't promise that would resolve if we had been doing this for a decade, that this would have dealt with the clear strategic power politics that was at play in Georgia and Florida for trying to manipulate the franchise in ways that would, or access to the voting booth in ways that would advantage certain parties. But I hope it would move things in the right direction. But I also think there are other kinds of interventions, honestly, that would be more important in the short run.
Okay, so one quick comment before I pass the mic. Like with Georgia especially, like when most people think of the state, they think of Atlanta. But there's way more to Georgia than Atlanta. Like, so yeah, there's town halls in the major cities, but like in the rural areas, like say along the Georgia-Florida border or along the Georgia-South Carolina border, was polling occurring there? Was outreach taking place there? That was the point of my question.
Oh, I see. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's something that we have a huge advantage on.
Yeah.
The large geographically dispersed districts is even more difficult and expensive and selected as to who shows up. We're dramatically, in dense urban environments, you just hop on the subway to go to a face-to-face town hall. In the state of North Dakota or in rural Georgia, you might have to go 100 miles to go to a town hall. Here, all you got to do is open your laptop, and if you don't have a laptop, then a smartphone. If you don't have a smartphone, as of right now, we don't have a good solution other than going to a public library, which we're trying to arrange for. So we are trying to go the extra mile and make sure that this is inclusive. And then the other thing I would say is, just to amplify something David said before, is that these sorts of events mobilize people who are traditionally marginalized and feel demotivated in standard politics. And you wouldn't have needed too many more of those people to tip the balances in Florida and Georgia.
The other thing I'll just note is some of the members who've indicated the greatest interest, because we've talked to a number of members of Congress about this, are the ones with districts that are far away and that are geographically large, for the very reasons that they don't have effective ways of connecting to their members. So like it's a lot, Atlanta, to some extent like New York, it's going to be a lot easier to access and connect with constituents through various face-to-face means. A lot harder in more remote and areas and rural areas. So.
In fact, it's the state capital too.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, I'm Michiel Stapper. I'm a visiting scholar here, and I found that talk very inspiring. It was really great, and it reminded me a little bit of an experiment by David van Rijbroek. He's in Belgium, from Belgium. And after the Belgian political parties failed to form a government, he did a similar experiment without the digital option. But he was also very surprised how reasonable people were to each other, so that's great. But he also paid the participants to come to his event. And I was wondering, how difficult do you think it will be to persuade participants to do the digital town halls? And another question is, I study citizen participation in urban development, And one of the most frustrating things for citizens is that they don't know really what happens with all the input. So is there also some kind of summary at the end of the town hall from, okay, this is what the main discussion points were, and this is what the congressman or woman is going to do about it?
Let me give half an answer, and Mike could give the other half. I think half the answer is grounded in some of the results that we had in terms of the people who participated. They were part of a survey panel, as we discussed, which meant that there was a certain background degree of compensation, but they also really enjoyed these events. And so part of the compensation for them was that they found these intrinsically valuable. They felt like they had been listened to, clearly. And I think that's not a substitute for actually being listened to. So that's an empirical question that in part we're doing a follow-on research. But I think part of the evidence that we can present is that 97% said they'd like to do this again. That their qualitative comments were tremendously positive, that they found that this was a worthwhile thing to do, and it was relatively less burdensome than traditional ways of, let's say, going to town halls and so on. So that's part one of the answer. Mike will give you part two.
Okay, so there's two parts of part two. The first part of part two is that we did a question, a survey wording experiment, where we varied whether you were talking to your member of Congress, a local official, or an expert. We varied whether it would take an hour or all day. We varied whether you could participate online or it was in person. We varied whether we were going to pay you, what level we were going to pay you or not pay you at all as an honorarium for attending, and it varied what the issue was versus important issues, things along those lines. And we permuted it. It was a 68-cell experiment, but we had lots of respondents. And the upshot of that was, at least hypothetically, this was a hypothetical invitation to deliberate, that paying people mattered, that it was statistically and substantively significant. People take the money happily, but it was not as large as several of the other factors. And so we think we've got some empirical evidence to suggest that it won't be terribly sensitive to price. And then the second part of the answer is we're experimenting with it. The idea, we want every member of Congress to do one or two of these a week. That's our crazy brass ring version of this. And if that's going to happen, either a foundation's got to dump a whole lot of money on us, or we've got to find a way to cut costs.
Are you watching?
Yeah, we're open to that solution as well. But even if you want to do that, we will use your resources efficiently and well. And so we're experimenting with different ways of doing recruiting that are less costly, that don't necessarily yield the gold standard representativeness that we had in the first round. And basically what we want to do is map the possibility frontier of that. And we think it's entirely plausible that as long as you just have safeguards so that this can't be crashed by people who is a group that only cares about pot legalization, or Indivisible or the Tea Party organizing, trying to disrupt town halls. That's their stated goals in some cases. As long as you can hedge against that, that you can probably construct, especially if you weight the responses afterwards to help it make the averages more representative, that we can cut costs a lot. But the answer is we're going to see.
Well, by the way, are there any questions online? I don't know if anyone's looking at the. If any of you on Twitter, if you're watching this, you hashtag IPK. So if you just look at hashtag IPK, we'll go on, but then we'll revisit whether there's anyone on Twitter, if there is anyone out there. So was there a hand way in the back?
There are a couple, Mike.
Oh, sorry. You're in charge.
Yes, David, Mike, thank you very much for all this insight and for this wonderful research that you have been doing. I really like the one thing that you mentioned about creating a two-way conversation, right? And to be sure that you are really creating with this kind of mechanisms as the town hall, this conversation. And I was wondering in this sense, as an academic, but also as someone who knows very well the public administration, I'm always very worried about the capacity that public institutions have to digest all this information that you can have after organizing these kind of initiatives, right?
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, so how do you think that we can measure success in this sense? And which kind of experiments do you think that we can do to be able to know if these institutions, after doing initiatives like town halls, like these ones, or face-to-face ones, are able really to take advantage of this? Thank you.
Great. That's a great question. When you say measure success, you mean success on influencing the empowered institutions,
Yes.
right? Okay, good. It's going to, I think, necessarily be a more qualitative effort, just simply because we're not going to have 2,000 political offices to sample from here, so we won't have anywhere near the same statistical power. But part of the idea, we actually are going to try to look at roll call votes. I showed you that experiment about the different voting behavior of the offices when they were provided with high quality estimates of public support in their district versus not. So that's one of the things that we will take a look at. Then, and this is sort of going back to Landemore, because we have representative government, it's not obvious that in every case a member of Congress or elected official should do even what the sort of considered opinions of their district are. I think that they should be given great weight, and especially in situations when we don't think that there's some technical component to the policy that the public might have trouble grasping, versus something where this is largely a values issue. And if those are the considered views of your constituents on a values issue, that there's ever a reason to think that they can grasp the basic technical and factual knowledge necessary, personally, I actually think at that point it should have almost dispositive weight. So another criterion of success would be looking at the kinds of cases where this sort of information is influential on the voting behavior of the offices. In addition, I think that there are broader representational activities than merely roll call votes. It could change the way members talk about the issues. And I don't mean talk about the issues in the way of manipulating things, but if you talk about immigration in a way that refers to immigrant populations as, forgive me, I work very, very hard, and it's important for my work that I not be political, but I'm going to take it as normatively uncontroversial that we shouldn't be talking about immigrant groups as racists and having diseases and shithole countries and things along those lines. This is just not constructive politics. That if the members of Congress begin to talk, even if they haven't changed their mind on the matter, in terms of flipping their vote, if the way that they talk about and a given issue raises the quality of public discourse, their reasons are stronger, their acknowledgement of legitimate opposition is higher, things along these lines, I would consider its success as well. And we're going to even be able to evaluate weaker things, which is, did they just have a serious discussion about it? Was this taken into account, whether or not it was decisive in the end? Did this inform their judgment? And I would love to hear if you have other ideas along these lines, but this is sort of what we've brainstormed before. We're not in the field yet on this. And we would love to think about, how they message out to their constituents, how they interact in co-sponsorship, what follow-up legislation would look like. We brainstormed this, so I have a list somewhere, and I don't think I'm faithfully recovering the entire list here. But is that getting it?
And part of what I would add is, like, if we get earlier in their pipeline of thinking about an issue, right? So it's like with immigration, we did it after they voted and so on. And so I think that's still important because there should be a degree of discussion and accountability for what they've done. And that's part of the equation, part of the magic of DRD, or directly representative democracy, is this accountability element. But there's also this element, the member doesn't start out as knowing what to do. And I think this becomes most powerful, I would hypothesize, when they're still forming what they should do, because I haven't locked into certain statements, certain positions, and so on. And so I think that's the element of being able to, like, if we can get enough members to do this, to see if that alignment, that responsiveness curve sort of kicks in, and whether we get members behaving differently who participated versus who didn't, controlling for partisanship and so on. But I think that's likely, that the treatment effect on members is likely to be greatest the earlier we do it in the discussion.
Yeah, and David might not even realize this because it was in a more recent round of things that he wasn't able to participate in, but we're explicitly talking with members about issues that they're not being whipped on yet, where the party whips are calling them and telling them how to vote. And we're explicitly trying to target issues that haven't crystallized in partisan terms yet, where there's no pressure coming from the parties yet, and where they really want to know what their constituents' informed views on the matter is. So we're trying to target that. And we have another side initiative where we've recruited one member already. We're looking for a pair where they would be the chair and ranking member of a subcommittee who would agree to do a national series of deliberative events tailored, where we tailored it to actual legislation, elements of legislation that they're working on, and then do it at such a scale that we'd have the statistical power to report to every congressional office what informed public opinion on that bill or elements of a bill would look like. And that would give us large enough leverage numbers to be able to statistically evaluate whether there was influence on the outcome.
Let's see if there are any final questions, because one of the things we like to do is to save time for informal discussion over wine and cheese for people to.
We believe in that.
As a fellow believer in wine and cheese, hi, my name is Manuel. I've got a... But?
I said they have a fellow deliberative Democrat.
An amateur one. So, hi, I'm here I've got a dual interest in your work, both because I'm a faculty member in an information systems group, as well as Beth was hinting, as I'm involved in organizing citizen deliberation events in my native country. And I'm very curious at this intersection of deliberation and the online realm. So I remember work from back in the 90s, I guess, in the group support decision systems, and this kind of literature on the impact of doing stuff online versus offline. So we have heard about the advantages in terms of representation, for example, and the lower cost of doing stuff online versus face-to-face. And I don't really know the literature well, so and because your work sits right in the middle, I am wondering if you've got any insights to share about what might get lost by having online deliberation happening in these settings versus face-to-face. Because I know firsthand about the costs of doing it face-to-face, right? The bill mounts very quickly, and I'd be curious if you could give us a hint on what might get lost on the way of doing it no longer face-to-face. Thanks.
I'll say a few things, and then so I think, there are a few elements. Like, one is, I think there's a degree of focus on attention when it's face-to-face that that when you're online you have like 20 tabs open, and they're calling to you, and so there's an element of being there in the moment. And this is more general than online town halls, but it's definitely relevant. It's life, right? We all feel our phones there, like calling to us right now, like who might have emailed us, what might have I missed on Facebook, and so on, that horrible pressure. And at least when you're in the room, there's a degree of suspension of, I can't look at my phone too many times while these guys are talking. And so that's one element. I think the other thing, and I don't think this is intrinsic, but there's an element of accountability in the interaction that's different when it's face-to-face than when it's online. And this is a good, bad thing, right? Like in our thing, for example, now this was by design, and it could have been designed differently, but there was no chance for follow-up. If I asked a question of a member and they answered something, there's no, wait a second, but you didn't address X, right? There's not even facial expressions, right? feeling? You know that it's sort of it's a bit of a New York expression. I mean, I grew up in the New York area, so I can say that. It's sort of like that skeptical look, like that you don't get that, right? And I think now some of that maybe we get the right emoticons. Get the skeptical emoticon clicked on. You could give people the right to follow up. And so there might be ways, I mean, there's a lot of elasticity to virtual settings. We would not want in-person town halls to disappear. This is not meant to be a substitute. And indeed, I think that one of the things, I mean, we were criticized on the Tea Party side when our first papers came out, and because the idea, it was interpreted, even though these happened well before the initial Tea Party events, that we were providing a way for members to evade accountability, face-to-face accountability of protesters showing up in town halls, and I suspect there may be some similar reaction on the side of Indivisible now. And I think that there is, and it's a different thing, but there's an important point around petitioning and being angry at your member. I think there's a role for that, within certain limits. But I think there also needs to be spaces for sincere deliberation and back and forth, and so which isn't intrinsic to online or in person, but there are certain ways that you can design the online town halls that they have lessons for in person, but they're also more controllable. Like if someone's screaming into their computer or writing obscenities on their computer, we can just say, nope, you don't get to post that, right? Whereas if it's in person, there's a limit to our physical control of the situation. And so those are at least my thoughts.
I'll be brief. For me, the antonym of reason is not emotion, but power. I have a capacious understanding of emotions, and I think that the main thing you lose, meaning that emotions can serve rationality in power, as a matter of fact, are essential in various respects. I've got some papers that are under review right now about this, and I think the biggest thing you lose online is the range of ability to express and receive emotional cues that direct our attention, that convey sincerity, that convey conviction, and in various other ways powerfully condition and supplement the exercise of reason and deliberative dynamics. And I think that gets thinned and leveled out quite a bit in an online environment, even if, as you've probably experienced, sometimes that's a good thing, right? When you don't have people shouting expletives.
Close us out with a 30-second story of how did you get this done? Because I can tell you, again, I was in Washington the other day and they held up the House Rule Book and they said, the House Rule Book is from 2008 and we haven't been able to update it. How did you manage to get all of this done with so many people? What did you give them?
We have to give credit, actually. We actually
This is
have
important.
credited. And so let me say, everyone, the Congressional Management Foundation is one of the best nonprofits in the world. They are a wonderful nonprofit devoted to, or founded by two former members of Democrat and Republican.
Staffers.
Staffers. 40 years ago, roughly speaking, who observed that you don't get elected to Congress because you can manage anything you want. And so they're devoted to helping members better manage things. And they're terrific, civic-minded nonprofit, and they were devoted to the notion of helping members do democracy better, and that they were really our snowplow in terms of dealing with the rules issues, getting members on board, and so on. And so, they're amazing. And so that's not a very pithy or great story, but like they're just a really, it's about a wonderful organization, wonderful people.
I can do mine in less than 30 seconds. The staffers are at least as important as the members.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's better to start with the staffers. And we're gonna have dinner together. I can flesh that out. But the bosses are oftentimes buzzing and confused, and the staffers often have more time and can know how to pitch things to their bosses, and almost always have their best interests in mind. And the ethics committee can talk to House administration So CMF was very much our entry into that, but these days I'm largely operating independent of, not independent, but with less reliance on CMF, but we don't contact any of the members direct. We always try to find an entrance through the staffers.
We'll have more war stories after a drink.
Well, we'll have to disseminate those more broadly. But for people who want the full story, please check out, go back to the first slide, Politics for the People. With the people, sorry, for the people, by the people, and with the people. And now, apropos with the people, how about some wine with the people?
Can I just say one more thing?
No.
Politicswiththepeople.com. We have the first chapter for free. All the papers are posted, and it's really reasonable on Amazon right now. $22. It's a steal.